People think I'm going to tell you not to fall in love after 60. That's what the title promises, isn't it? Some old woman wagging her finger, telling you to stay home, lock the door, keep your heart in a jar on the shelf where it can't get into trouble. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to tell you the truth. The kind of truth that doesn't come with a ribbon on it. The kind that sits in your chest like a stone you swallowed and can't cough up. I'm going to tell you what I've seen happen to men over 60 who go looking for love, and what it costs the women who let them find it. My name is Cecily. I'm 91 years old. I've buried a husband, raised 3 children, outlived most of my friends, and developed a very low tolerance for nonsense. And I've been alive long enough to see fashions come back around twice, to watch 3 wars start and end on the same television set, and to witness more marriages collapse than I could count if I used every finger and toe I have left. And at my age, not all of them work like they used to. Some of those marriages were beautiful, real partnerships built on trust and labor, and the slow, unglamorous work of choosing someone every single day, even when they leave wet towels on the bathroom floor. Some were prisons decorated with flower curtains and polite smiles. And some, the ones I want to talk about today, were mistakes made by men who confused loneliness with love and expected a woman to come along and fix what time had broken inside them. I want to be careful here because I'm not angry at men. Not as a species, anyway. Individually, I've been furious at a few, but as a group, no. I was married to a man for 53 years. No, 54. I always get confused about the first year because it went by so fast, I barely remember unpacking. His name was Harold, and he was a good man, not a perfect one. Good. He left his shoes by the front door every single night, like the house was a church and his loafers were an offering. He made me laugh on days when laughter felt like a foreign language. He once drove 45 minutes in a rainstorm to bring me a specific brand of ginger tea, because I had a cold and I'd mentioned, once in passing, that it was the only kind that helped. That's the kind of man Harold was. He listened even when it seemed like he wasn't. When he died 6 years ago, I sat on the edge of our bed for an hour without moving, not crying, just sitting, but feeling the weight of the mattress shift, because it had always shifted toward his side, and now it didn't, and that absence had a gravity all its own. I thought I'd follow him within the year. Some part of me wanted to. I didn't. Here I am, still occupying this body, still talking, still remembering the way he smelled like cedar and black coffee even in July. But Harold was not every man, and that is the very first thing I need you to understand before we go any further. I had a friend named Ruth Keegan. Thin woman, not tall, but she had a presence that made rooms feel smaller, in a good way, like she filled them up just by standing there. She was a retired librarian, and she had the kind of mind that remembered everything. Every title, every author, every conversation you'd had with her, going back to 1979. She was also one of the gentlest people I'd ever met, which is probably why what happened to her made me so angry that I'm still talking about it at 91. Ruth's husband, Thomas, died when she was 72. Heart attack on a Sunday morning, right there in the kitchen, still holding the newspaper. The crossword was half finished. She told me later that she finished it, not because she wanted to, because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. That's grief. It doesn't make sense. It just makes you move. Ruth grieved the way women of our generation grieve, quietly, thoroughly, with her hands still doing the dishes and her eyes somewhere else entirely. For 2 years she wore dark colors, not because anyone told her to, because she wasn't ready for brightness yet. Grief has its own wardrobe, and Ruth respected the dress code. She started painting during those 2 years. Watercolors, landscapes mostly, rolling hills and gray skies and rivers that looked like they were made of mercury. They were beautiful in a sad way, which is to say, they were beautiful in an honest way. She went to the library every Friday morning like it was church. She called me twice a week. She was rebuilding herself, brick by careful brick. And even though the building was smaller than before, it was hers. Then she met Gerald Gene Everett. Gerald was 68, recently divorced, and according to everyone who met him, charming. He had white hair combed neatly to the side, good posture, and the kind of smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He opened doors for women like it was a competitive sport. He brought flowers on first dates. And he said things like, "I just love listening to you talk," which I want to be clear is a sentence that should come with a warning label when spoken by a man over 60. Ruth told me about him on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because I was peeling apples for a pie, Granny Smith, the good kind, the ones that fight back when you try to peel them. And when she said his name, I nicked my thumb on the blade. Not because of him specifically, because of the way she said it, softly, carefully, like she was asking for permission just by mentioning him. "Cecily," she said, "do you think it's too soon?" Too soon, as if grief operates on a bus schedule, as if love checks in at the reception desk and waits for its name to be called. I told her I didn't know. That was honest. What I didn't tell her was the feeling in my stomach. A knot. Tight and low, the kind I get when something is about to go wrong and I can't prove it yet. Not jealousy. I want to make that very clear. I was not jealous of Ruth. I was afraid for her, because I had seen this before. I had watched older men, decent men, broken men, lonely men, walk into a woman's life like they were checking into a hotel, expecting someone to make the bed, stock the refrigerator, and leave mints on the pillow. And I was right to be afraid. Gerald moved in with Ruth within 4 months. 4 months. That's fast at any age. But after 60, that speed isn't romance. It's urgency. And urgency in an older man almost always means one thing. He doesn't want a partner. He wants a replacement. He wants someone to fill the shape left behind by the woman who used to do everything he never learned to do himself. And I'm not being cruel. I'm being accurate. There's a difference, even if the result stings the same way. Gerald didn't know how to cook. Not a single meal. Not eggs. Not toast. Not really. He'd burn it and then blame the toaster like it had a personal vendetta. He didn't know how to do his own laundry. Didn't know how to schedule a doctor's appointment or buy groceries or remember which medications he was supposed to take on which days. He had been married for 31 years to a woman named Diane, and Diane had handled all of it. Every single invisible task that keeps a human life running smoothly. The appointments, the groceries, the bills, the birthday cards, the emotional temperature of every room. Diane had managed it all. And when Diane left, not because she died, but because she finally got tired of being a wife and a mother and a secretary and a nurse all rolled into one unpaid position, Gerald didn't mourn the marriage. He mourned the service. That's a hard sentence. I know it is. I felt it leaving my mouth just now, and it has edges. But I've earned the right to say hard things. 91 years earns you that, if nothing else. You know, I spent a long time putting together what I've learned about this. Not just Ruth's story, but all the stories, all the patterns I've seen across decades of watching women give themselves away. I wrote some of it down, not as advice. I don't give advice, I just tell what I've seen. But if any of this is sounding like your life, if you're sitting there right now with a tight feeling in your chest, there's something I left in the first comment below this video, the pinned one. It's there for you whenever you need it. I think it might matter. Ruth became Gerald's new Diane within 6 weeks. She cooked his meals 3 times a day because Gerald didn't believe in leftovers, which is a stance I find both bizarre and exhausting. She organized his medications into one of those plastic pill organizers with the days of the week printed on the little lids. She reminded him to call his daughter Karen on her birthday. She ironed his shirts, and this detail is the one that still makes me want to overturn a table. Ruth had never once ironed a shirt for Thomas, because Thomas ironed his own shirts. Thomas did his own laundry from the day they married until the day he died. Thomas made dinner twice a week. Nothing fancy, usually pasta, but he did it without being asked and without expecting applause. That's the difference. That's everything. Here is what happens to a woman when she falls into that pattern after 60. And I want you to listen closely, because this part matters more than anything else I'm going to say today. She doesn't just lose her freedom. She loses herself. The self she spent 2 years of widowhood carefully, painstakingly reconstructing, like repairing a cathedral that someone had bombed. Ruth had learned to live alone. She had learned to eat dinner at whatever odd hour she pleased, to watch television shows that Gerald would have called silly, to go to bed with a novel and no one's cold feet pressing against her calves. She had discovered that she had opinions, strong ones, about where to hang pictures, what color to paint the bathroom, whether to get a cat. She did get a cat. A gray tabby named Penelope, who sat on her lap while she painted and purred like a small engine. Ruth had built a tiny, sacred, entirely sufficient life, and she handed the keys to a man who didn't even realize he was moving in to demolish it. I'm not saying Gerald was a villain. He wasn't. He was just a man who had never been taught to take care of himself, emotionally or domestically. And when he found a willing woman, he let her do it. That's not love. That's delegation. And delegation dressed up in flowers and compliments is still delegation. I said this to Ruth once, gently, over tea. Earl Grey, which was her favorite, she always held the cup with both hands, even in summer, like she was warming herself against something that had nothing to do with temperature. Ruth, I said, when was the last time Gerald cooked you a meal? She looked at me like I'd asked when the last time the cat had filed taxes. He doesn't cook, Cecily, she said. He has hands, I said. He has a stove. He has 68 years of watching other people use a kitchen. At what point does doesn't cook become won't cook? She changed the subject. She asked about my grandson's school play. I let her. But the question sat there between us on the table like a third cup of tea that nobody wanted to drink. Let me widen this, because Ruth's story is not unique. It's not even unusual. It's a pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Like one of those optical illusions where the vase becomes two faces, and then you can never look at it the same way again. Here is the pattern. A man over 60 loses his wife through death or divorce, and within months, sometimes weeks, he's looking for the next one. Not because he loved the first one so little that he's already moved on, but because he depended on her so completely that he can't function without the role being filled. He's not looking for love. He's conducting a job interview, the position, everything, the salary, his company, the benefits, none. Meanwhile, when a woman over 60 loses her husband, she grieves. She falls apart. She lies on the floor at 2 a.m. and wonders if this is what the rest of her life is going to feel like. And then, slowly, over months, sometimes years, she stitches herself back together. She learns she's capable of things she never had to do before. She learns to check the oil in the car, to fix the leaking faucet, to manage the finances, to unclog the drain. She learns she has opinions about furniture arrangement that were never consulted. She eats cereal for dinner and feels absolutely no guilt about it. She becomes, sometimes, for the first time in her entire adult life, a complete person who is not defined by being someone's wife. And then a man shows up, 67, well-dressed, holding flowers, charming, attentive, absolutely terrified of eating alone. And the woman who just learned to breathe on her own, holds her breath again. I spent 40 years making sure everyone in my house was fed, and not once, not a single time, did anyone ask if I was hungry. That's not a complaint. It's a geological fact, like saying the Grand Canyon is deep. You don't argue with it. You just stand at the edge and look. Plus, if that line stayed with you, if it landed somewhere in your ribs and wouldn't leave, check the pinned comment. The first one under the video, I left something there that goes deeper into this. Let me tell you about another man. His name was Donald Harwood, and he lived 2 streets over from me for 20 years. Tall man, quiet, the kind of person who nods more than he speaks, which some people mistake for depth. His wife, Margaret, died of cancer at 69. It was slow. It was cruel. The kind of death that takes a person piece by piece while everyone watches and pretends they're not watching, because acknowledging what's happening feels too much like giving it permission. Donald was devastated. I believe that. I was at the funeral, and his face looked like someone had taken an eraser to it and forgotten to draw the features back. 7 months later, 7, he was dating a woman named Susan. Susan was 58, younger than Donald by almost a decade, still coloring her hair a warm auburn, still wearing heels when the occasion called for it, still, and this is the part that matters, still willing to be impressed by a man who held the car door open and picked up the check. I am not mocking Susan. I liked Susan. She had a good laugh, the kind that came from her stomach, not her throat. But I am describing a trap, and Susan walked into it the way most women do, willingly, gratefully, and with absolutely no idea that the door was closing behind her. Because what Susan didn't know, what women in that position rarely know until it's too late, is that Donald wasn't choosing her. He was choosing the nearest warm body that could fill the Margaret-shaped absence in his daily routine. Susan could have been anyone. She could have been a mannequin with a pulse and a talent for pot roast. What mattered to Donald was not who Susan was, but what she could do. And what she could do was everything Margaret used to do. The tragedy, and I mean that word in its full weight, not the watered-down way people use it now, is that Susan was extraordinary. She was a retired schoolteacher who had spent 30 years teaching children to read. She had raised 3 kids on her own after her first husband left. She had survived a breast cancer scare at 44. She had a mind like a steel trap and a heart like an open window. But none of that mattered to Donald, because Donald didn't fall in love with a person, and he fell in love with a function. Here's a question that has lived in my head for years, spinning slowly like one of those mobile things they hang over cribs. Why do older men fall apart when they're alone, and older women fall together? I think it's because women have been practicing resilience their entire lives, even when no one called it that. Every time we cooked a meal we didn't feel like cooking. Every time we smiled at a party we didn't want to attend. Every time we held a feverish child at 3 a.m. while our husbands slept soundly, genuinely slept, not faking, because it never occurred to them that they should wake up. We were training. We were building a muscle that men never had to build because someone was always flexing it for them. And so when the someone disappears, when the wife dies or leaves or finally says, "I can't do this anymore," the man doesn't know how to use that muscle. He doesn't even know it exists. It's like asking someone to play piano when they've spent their whole life listening to someone else play. And instead of sitting down and learning the scales, instead of enduring the ugly, halting first attempts, he goes out and hires another pianist. Except the pianist is a woman. And she's not getting paid. I know that sounds harsh. Let it be harsh. I didn't make it to 91 by wrapping hard truths in cotton wool. My daughter Helen called me last spring. Helen is married to Richard, solid man, won't stop talking about golf, but I've made my peace with it. And she said, "Mom, there's a man at the senior center who's been asking about you." I said, "Trace, tell him I'm dead." Helen didn't think that was funny. I thought it was the funniest thing I'd said all year. But under the joke, there's something real, and it's this. I don't want a man. Not because I'm bitter. Not because Harold ruined me for anyone else. Although he did set the bar inconveniently high by being decent. But because I have finally, at 91 years old, constructed a life that belongs entirely to me. My tea is exactly the temperature I like it. My bed is the right firmness on both sides, because both sides are mine now. My mornings start when I decide they start. I read, I think, I remember things, and then I sit with those memories like they're old friends who came for a visit. I call my sons David and Paul on Sundays, and they tell me things they'd never tell their wives. Small worries, old regrets, questions they're embarrassed to ask anyone else. And I hold those confidences the way I hold everything, carefully with both hands, the way you carry something that could break. Why would I trade that for a man who needs someone to tell him where he put his reading glasses? Now, I must be fair, because Cecily Marrow is many things, but she is not unfair. At least she tries not to be. Not every older man is Gerald. Not every older man is Donald. There are men who do the work, men who learn to cook at 65 because their wife had a stroke, and someone needed to make dinner, and they realized that someone should have been them all along. Men who go to therapy at 70 because they finally admitted they've been carrying anger since 1974, and it's gotten too heavy to pretend it's not there. Men who sit with their loneliness like it's a guest they didn't invite, but refuse to throw out, because they've learned that sitting with uncomfortable things is how you become a person worth knowing. Those men exist. I've met a few. Harold was one of them, most of the time. Not always. He had his blind spots, and some of them were large enough to park a car in. There was a stretch, the 70s roughly, maybe bleeding into the early 80s, where Harold acted as if the house cleaned itself, the children raised themselves, and I was there primarily for decoration and the occasional casserole. I told him once during an argument about dishes of all the ridiculous things to go to war over, I said, "Harold, I am not the maid. I am the architect of this entire life, and you are standing in a house I built with my bare hands, complaining about the wallpaper." He didn't speak to me for 2 days. The house was very quiet. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Then he came back, came into the kitchen where I was kneading bread, because I always knead bread when I'm angry. It's the only acceptable way to punch something. And he said, "You're right. I'm sorry. Tell me what you need." That right there is the kind of man who is worth something after 60. The kind who can hear a hard truth, absorb it, and come back softer instead of harder. The kind who doesn't need a woman to survive but chooses to be with one because he has something to give, not just a list of things to take. I mentioned something earlier and in the first comment below. The pinned one. If you haven't looked yet, go look. It connects to this. It matters. But most of the men I've watched start relationships after 60, they weren't Harold. They were Gerald. They were Donald. They were men who spent their entire adult lives being tended to, and then looked genuinely bewildered when the tending stopped, as if the universe had broken a contract they never remembered signing, but had always benefited from. And the cruelest dimension of it, the part that can make me angry if I'm not careful, and at 91, I try to be careful with anger, because it tires me out, is that they don't see it. They honestly believe they're being romantic. They believe they're offering love. They believe that when they say, "I want to take care of you," they mean it in both directions. And maybe they do mean it. But what comes out in practice is a very specific kind of love. The kind that arrives with a job description stapled to the bouquet. I want to talk about the women for a moment, because the women are the ones who pay the price, and no one sends them an invoice, and no one reimburses them, and no one even says thank you. When a woman over 60 starts a relationship with one of these men, she doesn't just gain a companion. She gains a full-time position she thought she'd retired from. She gains the weight of another person's emotional and domestic illiteracy draped across her shoulders like a wet winter coat, heavy, cold, and impossible to set down gracefully without someone getting offended. And the worst part, the part that keeps me up at night, lying in my bed that still tilts slightly toward Harold's side, is that she often feels grateful that someone still wants her, grateful that she's not alone, grateful that at her age, with her gray hair and her creaky knees, and her body that no longer looks like the magazines say it should, a man looked at her and saw something worth pursuing. And that gratitude, that conditioned, poisonous, bone-deep gratitude, keeps her locked in. Because how do you leave someone when the entire world is telling you that you should be thankful anyone showed up at all? A woman's silence isn't peace. It's a room full of things she decided not to say. And I know that because I've lived in that room. I furnished it. I swept the floors. I hung pictures on the walls to make it look less like a prison. Ruth stayed with Gerald for 3 years. In those 3 years, she stopped painting. The watercolors, the gray skies, the rivers that looked like mercury, all of it gone. She stopped calling me as frequently. Our twice-a-week conversations became once a week, then every 2 weeks, then, "Oh, Cecily, I've been so busy." Busy doing what? Gerald's laundry, Gerald's meals, Gerald's emotional maintenance. She stopped going to the library on Friday mornings, which had been her sacred, non-negotiable ritual for over a decade. She became smaller, not just physically, though that happened too. She seemed to shrink, her shoulders curving inward like a plant that wasn't getting enough light. She became smaller in the way that women become smaller when they bend themselves around a man's needs. She took up less space. She made less noise. She had fewer opinions, or at least she stopped voicing them. She became wallpaper in her own home. And Gerald? Gerald gained weight. Gerald started sleeping better. Gerald joined a men's golf group. Gerald told everyone within earshot what a wonderful woman Ruth was. "She takes such good care of me," he'd say, beaming like a man who'd just checked into a 5-star hotel and couldn't believe his luck. Like Ruth was the concierge, and he'd left a glowing review on the comment card. I wanted to scream every time I heard it. I didn't. Women of my generation don't scream. We put the kettle on and we think about screaming, which is almost the same thing, but considerably less satisfying. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, because I'm almost to the part that matters most, check the pinned comment below. The first one. I've left something there that I think you need. When Ruth finally left Gerald, it wasn't dramatic. There was no thrown china. No suitcases hurled from windows. No monologue delivered in the rain. She simply came to my house one November afternoon, sat down at my kitchen table, accepted a cup of tea she didn't drink, and said, "Cecily, I forgot who I was." 5 words. That's all it took to describe 3 years of disappearing. She moved back to her own apartment. She found Penelope, the cat, had gained weight at the neighbor's house. Hadn't we all? She started painting again. She went back to the library. And she never, not once in the years since, looked for another man. Not because she was broken, not because Gerald had ruined her, because she was finally, fully, completely whole. And she was not going to hand that wholeness to anyone ever again. I think about Ruth every single day. I think about all the Ruths out there, women in their 60s, 70s, 80s, sitting right now in a living room across from a man who needs them far more than he will ever admit, performing labor that will never be named, shrinking themselves so that someone else can expand. And I think about the men, the Geralds and the Donalds and the dozens I haven't named, because naming them all would take more time than I have left. And at 91, I'm economical with my remaining hours. Men who are hearing this and thinking, that won't be me, but it might. If you've never cooked your own dinner regularly, it might. If you've never scheduled your own medical appointment without someone reminding you, it might. And if the longest you've ever been truly alone is a 3-day business trip to Cincinnati, it might. Here is my hard truth, and I'm giving it to everyone, but I'm looking at the men when I say it. Learn to be alone first. Not alone for a long weekend, while you clear your head. Not alone for a month while you get back on your feet. Alone in the way that women have always been alone. Alone in a house full of people who need you. Alone in a marriage that stopped seeing you 20 years ago. Alone in a world that decided you were invisible the moment your hair turned gray and your skin stopped being smooth. Sit in that aloneness. Let it teach you what it has to teach. Let it show you every single thing you never learned to do because someone was always doing it for you. Invisibly, thanklessly, without complaint. Learn to cook. Not because it's romantic, not because some television chef made it look fun, but because feeding yourself is the most basic act of self-respect that exists. And if you cannot do it at 65, that's not endearing. That's not a charming quirk. That's a crisis of adulthood that you've been allowed to get away with for decades because a woman was standing between you and the stove. Learn to feel. Not the way men are usually told to feel, which is attend one therapy session, cry once, and then check the box marked emotional growth. Actually feel. Sit in a room with no television and no phone and no one to perform competence for and ask yourself, who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when there's no one to impress, no role to fill, no woman to orbit around? If the answer frightens you, good. That's where the work begins. Learn to be a person, not a position. Because for too many men, husband is not a relationship. It's a job title. And when the position becomes vacant, they immediately start posting the listing. I'm not saying don't love again. I would never say that. Love is the only thing I've encountered in 91 years that makes the whole chaotic, beautiful, exhausting mess worthwhile. Harold's hands on my face. My children's first words. David said no before he said mama, which should have told me everything about his personality. The way Ruth looked when she painted, like she'd gone somewhere I couldn't follow, somewhere luminous and entirely her own. What I'm saying is, don't use love as a shortcut around the work you need to do on yourself. Don't use a woman as the answer to a question you've been avoiding for 40 years. Don't walk into someone's carefully constructed life and start rearranging the furniture because you're too uncomfortable to sit still in an empty room. My son David called me last week. He's 63. He's Harold's son through and through. Same jaw, same stubborn silence, same tendency to think that proximity is the same as intimacy. His wife, Carol, left him 2 years ago, not for another man, just away, which is somehow worse because you can't compete with away. You can't hate away. Away is just the sound of a door closing quietly. He said, Mom, I'm thinking about trying those dating apps. I said, David, can you make yourself dinner? He said, what does that have to do with anything? Everything, I said. It has to do with absolutely everything. He didn't understand, not yet, but he will. Because David is Harold's son, and Harold learned eventually. It took him a decade and one very fierce argument about dishes, but he learned. And I believe David will too. I have to believe that, because otherwise, what was any of it for? There's something in the pinned comment I want you to see before you go. It relates to everything I've been saying about what it means to be ready, truly ready, not just lonely. Take a look when you can. I want to close with something my mother said to me. My mother, Vivian, was not a warm woman. She was born in 1907 and raised in a world that had no patience for softness. She worked in a textile mill from the age of 14, and her hands were rough as sandpaper, and her opinions were rougher. She did not hug me often. She did not say, "I love you." I don't think the words existed in her vocabulary the way they existed in mine. But she told the truth, always, even when the truth was a door you didn't want to walk through. One day, when I was about 30, young, exhausted, up to my elbows in diapers and dishes, and the daily machinery of a household that everyone enjoyed but no one helped operate, she looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Cecily, a woman alone is just a woman. A man alone is an emergency." I laughed. I laughed because it was funny, and because laughter was cheaper than crying, and because my mother's delivery was impeccable, dry as toast, sharp as glass. I'm not laughing anymore, because she was right. And more than 60 years later, not enough has changed. At the men who start relationships after 60 and make them genuinely work, not work as in she does everything and he's comfortable, but work as in two whole people choosing each other every day, are the men who learned they are not emergencies. They are the men who sat alone in a quiet house and didn't immediately call someone to fill the silence. They are the men who figured out how to feed themselves, clothe themselves, comfort themselves, entertain themselves, grieve by themselves. Men who enter a woman's life as a guest who brings something, not a tenant who expects the rent to be free. And the women who thrive after 60, truly thrive, not just survive, are the ones who stop confusing love with labor, who learn that being alone is not the same as being lonely, who understand that at 60, at 70, at 91, they have earned the right to be choosy, to be particular, to be difficult even, to look at a man who can't boil an egg and say, "No, thank you," and to look at an empty house and say, "Yes, this is enough. This is mine." I'm sitting in Harold's chair right now. The leather is cracked and the cushion sags in the middle, and my daughter keeps suggesting I replace it, and I keep telling her that the day this chair leaves this house is the day I leave with it. It still smells like him, faintly, if I press my face into the headrest and breathe in deep. Cedar and coffee. Some days that smell is a comfort. Some days it's a knife. Most days it's both, and I've made my peace with that. I miss him. Lord, I miss him. Some nights I miss him so much my teeth ache, which doesn't make any medical sense, but grief has never been interested in medical sense. But I would not trade this quiet, this hard-earned, sometimes lonely, sometimes exquisite quiet, for any Gerald or any Donald or any man who wants me to remind him to take his blood pressure medication. My mother was wrong about one thing, though. A woman alone is not just a woman. A woman alone, after everything she has survived and carried and built and lost and rebuilt, that woman is a cathedral, and she doesn't need anyone to come in and rearrange the pews. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get this sharp, but sometimes the truth has edges, and I've spent too many years filing them down for other people's comfort. At 91, I've retired from that particular job. If you've listened this far, you're either a woman who saw herself in these words, or a man who is willing to sit with something uncomfortable and not walk away. Either way, I'm grateful you stayed. And the pinned comment, the first one, right below, is there for both of you. I would not mention it if I didn't think it mattered. I promise you it's worth your time. Take care of yourself, not because someone told you to, not because you're performing wellness for an audience, because you looked in the mirror and decided, maybe for the first time, maybe for the 100th, that you are worth the effort. That's all I have for today. Well, that's not true. I have decades more. But this is enough for one afternoon. Enough for one old woman sitting in a cracked leather chair that smells like a man she loved. Enough for now.